The morning it happened, I was making his coffee the way I had for 43 years. 2 sugars, a splash of whole milk, heated in the microwave for exactly 20 seconds after brewing because Gerald said it was always too hot straight from the pot. 43 years of 20-second intervals. 43 years of 2 sugars. 43 years of a ritual so embedded into my muscle memory that I could have done it blindfolded, half dead, or, as it turned out, on the very morning my entire life was about to be demolished. I was 68 years old. My hands, the ones that had raised 3 children, buried both of my parents, stitched Halloween costumes at midnight, and held Gerald's face during his bypass surgery 6 years prior, placed that mug on the kitchen table with the same quiet care they always had. He didn't look up from his phone. "I want a divorce, Margaret." I thought I'd misheard him. I actually laughed, a small, confused sound, the kind you make when someone says something so outside the boundaries of logic that your brain simply refuses to file it correctly. "What did you say?" He put the phone down then, and he looked at me with eyes I had loved since 1981, eyes I had searched for comfort in hospital waiting rooms, eyes I had watched crinkle at the corners during our children's weddings, eyes that were now looking at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's decided to throw out. Cold, decided, done. "I've already spoken to a lawyer, Maggie. The paperwork is being drawn up this week." He picked his phone back up. "I'm taking the house, the car, the joint savings account. My pension is protected, so you won't see a dime of that. You'll get the old Camry and whatever's in your personal checking account." He paused and seemed to do a mental calculation. "That's maybe $4,000. I stood there in my bathrobe, holding the dish towel I'd been drying my hands on, and I felt the floor move. Not metaphorically, I genuinely felt the linoleum shift beneath my feet, the way the ground feels during a minor earthquake, that horrible, disorienting realization that the thing you are standing on is not as solid as you believed. "Gerald," he said, "I've been unhappy for a long time. I think deep down you've known that." And then he picked up the coffee I'd made him, took a long sip, nodded slightly as though it were satisfactory, and walked out of the kitchen. I stood there for a very long time. $4,000. 68 years old. 43 years of 2 sugars and 20 seconds, and he wanted to leave me with $4,000? You need to understand who I am before you can understand what I did next. Because if you picture a frail, defeated old woman crumpling to the floor, that's not quite the full picture. But it's not entirely wrong either, not in those first hours. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the middle daughter of a tobacco farmer and a seamstress. We were not rich people. My mother made our clothes from patterns she traced out of magazine clippings. My father worked land that wasn't entirely his until I was nearly 12 years old. What we had, we built ourselves, and what we built, we protected. My mother used to say, "Margaret, pretty fades and men wander. The only thing that belongs to you permanently is what's inside your head. Fill it up." I was the first person in my family to go to college, nursing school at UNC Greensboro, 1974. I worked my way through it. I waited tables at a diner on Battleground Avenue for 3 years, wore compression socks at 20 years old because my feet ached so badly by closing time that I could barely get my shoes off. I graduated. I got my RN. I was proud. I met Gerald Wallace at a July 4th party in 1979. He was handsome, I won't pretend he wasn't. Broad shoulders, dark hair, a smile that started slow and then took over his whole face. He was in real estate, freshly licensed, ambitious in the way that young men in 1979 were allowed to be ambitious without it frightening anyone. He asked me to dance twice and called the next morning. We married in 1981. I was 24, he was 27. For the first 10 years, it was good, genuinely good. We were broke and busy and young and in love with the idea of what we were building. Gerald's real estate career grew steadily. I worked full-time as a registered nurse until our second child, then part-time. Then I stepped back entirely when our youngest was born with a heart condition that required 3 surgeries before his 5th birthday. That was my choice. I want to be clear about that. Nobody forced me out of nursing. I chose my family. I chose to be home, to be the one who managed the house and the doctor's appointments and the school pickups and the grocery lists and the social calendar and the finances. Yes, I managed the household finances, paid every bill, maintained every account, tracked every dollar for the better part of 3 decades. Because Gerald was busy. Gerald was building. And I believed with every thread of my being that what he was building for us. The house was paid off, our home in Asheville, North Carolina, a 4-bedroom craftsman on 2 acres with a wraparound porch and a stand of oak trees in the back that turned gold and copper every October. We'd bought it in 1994 for $210,000. By the time Gerald sat down with that coffee mug and dismantled my life, it was worth $900,000. Our joint savings account held just over $340,000. Money I had budgeted for, money I had protected during 2 recessions, a housing crash, and Gerald's mediocre investment decisions in the early 2000s, which I had quietly redirected before he could lose too much of it. His pension from 30-plus years in commercial real estate, substantial, structured, protected under his name. My own personal checking account, a little over $4,000. I had given everything to the architecture of our life together. I had no career to return to. My nursing license had lapsed years ago. I was 68 years old with arthritic hands, $4,000, and a husband who was looking at me like furniture. That was my situation. And in those first hours, I won't lie to you, I cried. I sat on the edge of our bed, the bed I had made that very morning with military precision because Gerald liked tight hospital corners. And I cried in a way I hadn't cried since my youngest son's 2nd open-heart surgery. The deep, ugly, animal kind of crying, the kind with no performance in it whatsoever. I cried until I was empty. And then something shifted. It was my mother's voice, clear as a bell, clear as if she were sitting right beside me on that tight-cornered bed. "Fill it up, Margaret." I stopped crying. I wiped my face. I sat straight, and I started to think. Here's the thing about spending 43 years with a person. You know their rhythm so well that disruption sounds almost like a physical noise. Looking back, and I did a great deal of looking back in the days following his announcement, the signals had been there. I had noticed them the way you notice a dripping faucet, registered, filed, attributed to something mundane, forgotten. The phone, first of all. Gerald had always been casual with his phone, left it on the counter, on the table, face up. He was not a private man by nature. But in the past year, the phone had started going everywhere with him, into the bathroom, to bed, face down on the nightstand, into his office, door closed, which was new, the closed-door office, because Gerald had never been a closed-door person. I had noticed. I had told myself it was work. He'd taken on a consulting role with a development company out of Charlotte, and the hours were odd, and I thought nothing of it. The trips, second of all. Gerald had always traveled for work, so trips themselves were not suspicious, but the frequency had increased. 4-day weekends in Raleigh and Charlotte, once to Savannah. He came back from Savannah with a tan that didn't match a business trip in February, and I remember this specifically, I had looked at him and felt a small cold needle in my chest, and then I had made dinner and let it go. Third, the account. About 8 months before the coffee mug morning, Gerald had casually mentioned that he was restructuring some of our investments and would be moving some funds around. He used words like liquidity and rebalancing and consulting fees, and I, Margaret, who had managed our finances for 30 years, had nodded. I had let him, because he seemed to know what he was talking about, and because I was dealing with a knee procedure at the time, and because after 43 years I had let my vigilance soften into trust. I had nodded. It was the only time in 30 years I had nodded without verifying, and it would turn out to be the single most expensive nod of my life. After his announcement, when I went to look carefully at the joint savings account, really look, pull every statement, trace every transfer, I discovered that over the course of 11 months, Gerald had moved $160,000 out of our joint savings into an account I had never seen before. Incremental transfers, $8,000 to $15,000 at a time, spaced out just far enough apart to avoid pattern recognition, just under the amounts that would trigger automatic bank alerts. He had done it carefully, deliberately, over almost a year. He had been planning this, not for weeks, not for months. For nearly a year, while I made his coffee and managed his household and washed his shirts, Gerald Wallace had been methodically preparing to leave me with nothing. I sat with that knowledge for a long night, and then in the morning I called my daughter. My daughter, Rachel, is 41 years old, sharp as a tack, and works as a litigation paralegal in Charlotte, which is either a great coincidence or proof that God occasionally has a sense of humor. Rachel drove up from Charlotte the same day I called her. She arrived at 7 in the evening, walked through the front door with a rolling suitcase and a laptop bag, took one look at my face, and said, "Tell me everything." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural tendency. She took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, I need you to give me access to every financial account you can get into tonight, every statement, every login, every document you can find." We sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning. What Rachel found, what we found together, was worse than I had imagined. The $160,000 from the joint account had been moved to a private LLC, a limited liability company called WGC Holdings, registered in South Carolina, established 14 months prior. Gerald C. Wallace, sole member. WGC Holdings had then been used to purchase a condominium, a 2-bedroom unit in a newly developed building in downtown Asheville, 4 miles from our house, purchased 11 months ago for $205,000. The LLC had taken a small mortgage, and the down payment had come directly from our savings. The condominium was not empty. Rachel, who knew how to find these things, pulled the public property records and cross-referenced them with social media, and there she was, a woman named Danny Colcord, 34 years old, a yoga instructor and Airbnb host, long blonde hair, the kind of effortlessly casual wardrobe that takes real money to maintain, and approximately 340 Instagram posts over the past year, many of which featured in the background or occasionally front and center items I recognized. the gray wool blanket from Gerald's home office, a bottle of Blanton's bourbon with a distinctive stopper that I had given Gerald for Christmas 2 years ago. In one photo, not Gerald himself, but his hand. I knew that hand. I had held it in hospitals and at funerals and across 43 years of dinner tables, his hand resting on her shoulder. Posted 8 months ago with the caption, "Home is wherever you make it feel safe." I looked at that photo for a long time. Then I looked at Rachel. "He wasn't just planning to leave you," Rachel said. Her voice was very steady. She gets that from me. "He's been building a whole second life, and he wanted to get divorced before you could find any of this, so he could claim the LLC was a business asset and keep it out of the settlement." "I moved our money into it." "Yes, Mom." I looked at my hands on the table, the arthritic knuckles, the thin skin. 68 years old. "I thought I wouldn't look," I said. Rachel reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "He's never known you very well, has he?" I want to be honest with you about the next 72 hours because I think people skip over this part. They jump to the revenge. They want the triumphant music and the justified fury and the satisfying collapse of the villain. And we'll get there. I promise you, we'll get there. But first, there were 72 hours. I didn't sleep the first night. I lay in that bed with the hospital corners, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the bypass surgery 6 years ago. Gerald's heart had done something terrifying and sudden, and I had been at the hospital before the ambulance arrived because a neighbor had called me while the paramedics were still in our driveway. I had sat in that waiting room for 4 hours. I had held his hand in recovery and told him he was not allowed to leave me. I had meant it as a joke and as a prayer simultaneously. I had cried in the hospital bathroom where he couldn't see me, so that when I came back to his bedside, I could be calm. For him. "You are not allowed to leave me." He had been planning to leave me while I sat with him in cardiac recovery. He had been, I don't know exactly when it started, but Danny's Instagram account went back further than 14 months, further than the LLC, and at some point in my 2 a.m. research, I have found photos that suggested the relationship was at least 3 years old. Which meant during his bypass surgery, during his recovery, during the 6 months I had restructured our entire life to manage his rehabilitation and his diet and his medications, he had already been with her. I lay in that bed and I felt something that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It wasn't rage, though that was there too. It was more like recalibration, the sensation of understanding that the map you've been using for decades is wrong, has always been wrong, and you've been navigating a false landscape for years, making your careful way across terrain that wasn't real. The second day, Gerald came home. He'd been staying somewhere else, the condo presumably, to collect some clothes. He was businesslike about it, polite in the distant way you're polite to a hotel concierge. He mentioned that his lawyer would be in touch by end of week. I sat at the kitchen table and watched him move through the house. I did not tell him what I knew. Not yet. My mother used to say another thing: never show your cards to a man who's already dealing from the bottom of the deck. He left with a duffel bag. I watched his car back out of the driveway from the kitchen window, my kitchen, my driveway, my 43 years, and I felt the recalibration complete itself. The grief was real. I don't want to pretend it wasn't. The marriage was a genuine life. There were real years in it, real tenderness, real love. I believe that, even now. People are capable of real love and real betrayal simultaneously, and that is one of the most painful things about being human. But the grieving woman and the strategic woman had to coexist because the strategic woman had work to do. I called my son Daniel, a CPA in Raleigh. I called Rachel back, and then, on the recommendation of a friend whose opinion I trust above nearly anyone's, I called a family law attorney named Patricia Oakes. Patricia Oakes was 64 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and had been practicing family law in North Carolina for 31 years. She had the posture of a woman who has won in rooms where people expected her to lose, and she listened to my story with the focused stillness of someone who already knows how it ends. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Wallace, I'd like to take your case." She paused. "I'd like very much to take your case." North Carolina, you should know, is an equitable distribution state. This means that in a divorce, marital assets are divided fairly, not necessarily 50-50, but equitably, with consideration for each spouse's contribution to the marriage. It also means that assets one spouse attempts to hide, dissipate, or fraudulently transfer prior to divorce proceedings are subject to something called a claim of dissipation of marital assets, which in plain English means if you try to sneak money out the back door before the divorce, a judge will not only make you put it back, they will often penalize you for it. Gerald did not know that I had found the LLC. Gerald did not know that I had, on Patricia's advice, immediately frozen the joint savings account, which I had equal rights to do as a joint account holder before he could touch whatever remained. Gerald did not know that Rachel had printed and preserved every bank statement, every transfer record, every piece of documentation connecting WGC Holdings to our marital funds. Gerald did not know that I had also, quietly, methodically, over the course of our marriage, kept personal records of every financial contribution I had made to our household, the budgets I'd managed, the crises I'd navigated. A habit my mother had instilled in me so deeply that I'd done it almost without thinking. A woman should always know the numbers, and she should be able to prove them. 30 years of files in a cabinet in my personal office that Gerald had apparently never opened or considered relevant. When his lawyer sent the initial divorce filing, it was exactly what he'd described over that coffee mug. He was claiming the house, the car, the joint savings, his pension protected, and a settlement offer of $20,000 to me, framed generously as a goodwill gesture. Patricia read the filing, set it down on her desk, and smiled the way a chess player smiles when their opponent makes a very predictable move. "Perfect," she said. Our response was filed within the week. Patricia documented the dissipation claim in full. The $160,000, the LLC, the condominium, the timeline of the transfers, the fact that this had been orchestrated over 11 months while the marriage was still legally intact and while Gerald had explicitly told me he was simply rebalancing investments. We submitted the bank records. We submitted the LLC registration documents. We submitted Danny Calcord's Instagram posts. Yes, courts accept social media evidence, with the marital property clearly visible in the background. We also submitted my 30 years of financial management records. Patricia argued that my decades of unpaid labor managing the household, raising the children, supporting Gerald's career advancement, and personally stewarding our finances had been the direct and documentable foundation of the wealth Gerald was now attempting to claim entirely for himself. She had a forensic accountant calculate what my contributions were worth in market rate terms: household management, child care, financial administration, caretaking during Gerald's bypass recovery, and the number was significant. His lawyer called Patricia 2 days after our filing. I was told the conversation was brief. Gerald's lawyer had evidently not known about the LLC, or rather, Gerald had not fully disclosed it to his own lawyer, which created a separate and deeply uncomfortable professional situation for said lawyer. People do this. They hire attorneys and then lie to them or omit things because they're afraid of being judged or because they think they can manage the exposure. It rarely ends well. There were several weeks of back and forth. Gerald, through his lawyer, attempted to argue that WGC Holdings was a legitimate business investment predating the divorce decision. Patricia dismantled this with the financial timeline. Gerald attempted to argue that the condo was purchased with money that was functionally his personal earnings contribution. Patricia introduced North Carolina case law establishing that commingled marital funds used for any purchase make that purchase a marital asset regardless of the account it passed through. Gerald, apparently, had several conversations with his lawyer that he described to mutual friends as brutal. Good. Here is how it resolved. The house in Asheville, the $900,000 Craftsman with the wraparound porch and the October oaks, was awarded to me. Fully. Not as a split, not as a buyout arrangement. To me. The dissipation claim meant that Gerald's hidden transfers were treated as an advance against his share of marital assets, and when you subtracted $160,000 from his half, the math no longer supported a 50-50 split of the home's equity. The joint savings account, $340,000, now frozen, was split but not evenly. Patricia successfully argued for a 60-40 split in my favor, accounting for both the dissipation and my documented financial contributions. I received $204,000. The condominium purchased through WGC Holdings was ruled a marital asset. Gerald was ordered to sell it and split the proceeds with me or buy my share at appraised value. He chose to buy my share. My half came to approximately $90,000. Gerald's pension, the one he had described as protected and beyond my reach, was subject to a qualified domestic relations order, commonly known as a QDRO. North Carolina courts can and do divide pension benefits earned during a marriage. I would receive a portion of his monthly pension payments for the rest of my life. I also received spousal support. Given the length of the marriage, my age, the career I had set aside, and the significant disparity in our financial positions, the support was substantial and indefinite, meaning it would continue until either my death, Gerald's death, or my remarriage. At 68, I was not particularly worried about the third condition affecting the arrangement. Gerald Wallace, who had sat at my kitchen table with a coffee mug I had prepared and told me he was taking everything, walked away from 43 years of marriage with a percentage of his own pension, a diminished share of the savings account, no house, no proceeds from the condo sale, and a monthly spousal support obligation that his new girlfriend with the Instagram account was reportedly not very pleased about. He also walked away with the old Camry, which, and I want to be precise here, needed a new transmission. I kept the newer car. There is a version of this ending where I tell you I danced in my kitchen, where I felt the clean, soaring triumph of justice perfectly delivered, where the gavel came down and my heart sang. The truth is a little quieter than that. But it is also, I think, more real and more worth telling. The morning after the final settlement was signed, I woke up in my house with the wraparound porch. I made myself coffee, 1 sugar, because I've always preferred it that way, and it turns out 43 years of 2 sugars was for him, not for me. And I took it out to the porch, and I sat in the early November cold, and I watched my oak trees. They were bare by then, the last of the copper leaves down. But the structure of the trees was beautiful, the architecture of them, the way they'd grown around each other and toward the light over the decades. It was its own kind of map, and it was mine. I thought about my mother. I thought about nursing school and the compression socks and the diner on Battleground Avenue. I thought about 3 children and 2 acres and 1 bypass surgery and 1 morning with a coffee mug. I thought about Gerald, not with bitterness precisely, though bitterness was part of it. I thought about him the way you think about a story you've read carefully, whose ending surprised you, whose meaning you're still working out. He had looked at me and seen someone who wouldn't look back. That was his mistake. That has always been the mistake people make. My children call me every Sunday now. Daniel drove up from Raleigh last month and we raked the oak leaves together, which sounds small and is enormous. Rachel comes when she can, and we sit on this porch and we drink coffee, and sometimes she brings the legal pad from that first night. She kept it, and we look at the notes she wrote, and we are both a little astonished by what they led to. I have, at 68 years old, more financial security than I had at any prior point in my life. The settlement, the house's equity alone, means I am stable, genuinely stable. I have taken my nursing license out of its lapse, and I'm in the recertification process, not because I need the income, but because my mother was right. What's inside your head belongs to you permanently, and it turns out I still want to fill it up. I started volunteering at a legal aid center in Asheville 2 months ago, working with women, mostly older women, mostly in my position, who are navigating divorce without resources, without knowledge, without anyone sitting across a kitchen table saying, "You can do this, and here's how." I think about what might have happened if I hadn't had Rachel, if I hadn't had Patricia Oakes, if I hadn't had 30 years of organized files in a cabinet that Gerald never opened. What I want you to take from this story, what I would have wanted sitting on the edge of that tight-cornered bed in my bathrobe, is not "here is how to get revenge." It's something simpler and more important than that. Know your numbers. Know your worth. Know that the thing you are standing on is solid because you built it, and it belongs to you, and no one, not even someone who has shared 43 years of coffee with you, can take it without your consent. I am 68 years old. I am the first person in my family to go to college. I raised 3 children and managed 1 household and protected 1 financial life and held 1 man's hand in 1 hospital for 1 very long night, and I did all of it with more skill and more grace than he ever stopped to measure. He wanted everything. He took the old Camry and a pension he now shares with me. And I am sitting on my porch, in my house, with my coffee, watching my oak trees in the November morning light. 1 sugar, the way I always liked it. Don't mistake my patience for ignorance. I've been paying attention to everything.